Chapter 21. The temperature was fixed for an early hour next morning. No time was to be lost, for it would take us 5 days to reach the crossroads. I need not dwell on the sufferings of our return. My uncle bore them like a man who is angry with himself for yielding to weakness. Hans, with the resignation of his placid nature, and I, to speak the truth, complaining and despairing the whole time. I could not bear up against this stroke of ill fortune. As I had foreseen, the water came to an end at the very first day of our journey back. Our only store of liquid was now gin. But this horrible drink burned the throat, and I could not even endure the sight of it. I felt the temperature stifling. Fatigue paralyzed me. More than once I fell motionless. Then I had to come to a halt, and my uncle or the Icelander did their best to revive me. But I saw already that the former was struggling painfully against the extreme fatigue and the tortures of thirst. At last, on Tuesday, the 7th of July, dragging ourselves along on our knees and hands, we arrived half dead at the junction of the two passages. There I lay like an inert lump, stretched full length on the lava floor. It was 10 a.m. Hans and my uncle, clinging to the wall, tried to nibble a few bits of biscuit. Long moans escaped my swollen lips. I fell into a profound stupor. After a little, my uncle came to me and, lifting my arms, said in a genuine tone of pity, "Poor child!" His words touched me, for I was not accustomed to tenderness from the austere professor. I seized his trembling hands in mine. "Let me do it," and looked at me. Tears stood in his eyes. I saw him lift the gourd slung at his side, and to my great bewilderment, he put my lips and said, "Drink!" Had I heard him right? Was my uncle mad? I looked at him stupidly. I could not understand him. "Drink!" he repeated. And lifting up his gourd, he drained the contents into my mouth. Oh, infinite boon! A gulp of water moist my burning mouth. One only, but it sufficed to call back my ebbing life. I thanked my uncle with clasped hands. "Yes," he said, "a mouthful of water. The last. Do you hear? The last. I kept it on purpose for you. 20 times, 100 times, I have to fight with my fearful longing to drink it. But no, Axel, I kept it for you." "Oh, uncle," I murmured, and big tears started in my eyes. "Yes, poor child, I knew when you reached these crossroads you would drop down half dead, and I kept my last few drops of water to revive you." "Thanks, thanks." Slightly my thirst was quenched. I had somewhat recovered my strength. The muscles in my throat, which became more contracted, now relaxed. The inflammation of my lips subsided. I could speak. "Well, come," I said. "There is only one course open to us now. Our water is done, and we must go right back." While I was speaking, my uncle avoided looking at me, and hung down his head, unwilling to meet my eyes. "We must go back, and find our way to Snæfell. May God give us strength to climb the summit of the crater." "Go back," said my uncle, speaking to himself, it seemed, more than to me. "Yes, go back, without losing an instant." A pretty long silence ensued. Then, in an odd tone, the professor went on to say, "Well then, Axel, those few drops of water have not restored your strength and courage?" "Courage! I see you are as downhearted as ever, and will still speak despairingly. What sort of man was I to do with, and what projects was his bold spirit still entertaining? What? Are you unwilling? Shall I give up this expedition at the very moment, and everything promises success? Never! Then we must make up our minds to perish. No, Axel, no. Start off. Let Hans go with you. Leave me alone." "Leave you behind?" "Yes, I tell you. Leave me here. I have commenced the journey, and I will complete it, or never return. Go, Axel, go." My uncle was violently excited. His voice, which had softened for an instant, sounded harsh and threatening. He was struggling with gloomy energy against impossibilities. I was unwilling to leave him at the bottom of the abyss, and yet the instinct of self-preservation urged me to fly from it. The guide watched this scene with his accustomed indifference. He understood what was going on. However, our gestures showed him that each was trying to drag the other a different road. But Hans evidenced no interest in the question. Through his own life, he was involved in it. He was only to go to if the signal to start was given. Ready to stay in obedience to the slightest wish of his master. What would I not have given to that moment to have been able to make him understand me? My words and groans and accent would have moved his cold nature. I would have pointed out dangers which he had never seemed to suspect. I would have made him fully alive to them, and together we might perhaps have succeeded in convincing this obstinate professor. Nay, if all other means failed, we may have compelled him to regain the summit of Snaffel. I went up to Hans and laid my hand on his. He did not stir. I pointed to the way of the crater. He still remained motionless. Gasping breath showed my sufferings. The Icelander gently shook his head and, quietly pointing my uncle, said, "Master." "The master!" I cried. "Madman! He is not your master of your life. We must fly. We must drag him along. Do you understand?" I grasped Hans by the hand, and he was trying to make a get-up. I struggled with him, but my uncle interposed and said, "Be calm, Axel. You will get nothing of that impressionable servant. Listen, therefore, to what I propose." I crossed my arms and looked at my uncle in a firm face. The want of water," he said, is the only obstacle in our path. In this tunnel to the east, composed of lavas, schists, and coal, we have not found a single drop of liquid. It is possible we may be more fortunate if we explore the one to the west. I shook my head with profound incredulity. "Hear me to the end," said the professor in a constrained voice. "While you were lying motionless, I went to examine the configuration of the passage. It leads straight to the heart of the globe, and in a few hours we shall reach the granite foundation. There we must meet with the springs in abundance. The nature of rock favors this, and instinct agrees with logic in support of my conviction. Now, this is what I propose to you. When Columbus asked his ship's crews for 3 days longer to let him discover new countries, the men, sick and dismayed as they were, allowed the justice of his demand. And he discovered the New World. I am the Columbus of these subterranean regions, and I ask you to give me 1 day more. If I have not found water before the time expires, I swear you will return to the surface of the earth." In spite of my irritation, I was moved by my uncle's words and by the violent restraint he was putting on himself. "Very well," I said. "It shall be as you wish, and may God reward your superhuman energy. You have only a few hours to try your fortune, so let us start at once." Chapter 22. The descent commenced by this time by the new gallery. Hans walked first as usual. We had not gone 100 steps when the professor, throwing the light of his lantern on the wall, exclaimed, "Here are the primitive rocks. We are on the right track. Forward, forward!" When the earth's surface gradually cooled in the first stages of its formation, the diminution of its bulk produced disruptions, rents, contractions, and chasms. The passage itself was a fissure of this kind, through which the erupted granite had forced the passage at some time. The myriad windings formed an inextricable labyrinth through the primordial rock. The deeper we went, the more clearly defined became the successive layers of the primitive period. Geological science considers this primitive rock as the basis of the mineral crust. She recognizes in it 3 distinct layers: the schist, the gneiss, and the mica schist, resting in the immovable rock called granite. Never before were mineralogists such wondrously favorable circumstances for studying their science. What a boring machine, an insensible inert instrument, could not bring to the surface. We could examine with our eyes and touch with our hands. Through the beds of schists, colored with beautiful shades of green, metallic threads of copper and manganese, mixed with traces of platinum and gold, were twisted and intertwined. I could not but think what riches are hid in the depths of the earth, which covetous humanity that will never appropriate. These treasures would have been buried so deep by the convulsions of primeval times that neither mattock nor pickaxe will ever disturb them. To the schists called gneiss of a stratiform structure and remarkable for the regularity of and parallelism of the laminae, then the mica schists disposed in great flakes, which are revealed to the eye by the sparkles of the white mica. The light of our lanterns, caught by the little facets of the rocky mass, flashed up by brilliant jets at every angle, and I could have fancied myself traveling through a hollow diamond, in which the rays crossed and mingled and shot out in 1,000 brilliant coruscations. About 6 o'clock, this illumination began to lose its splendor and almost ceased. The walls assumed a crystallized but somber appearance. The mica became more closely mingled with the feldspathe and quartz, to form the rock par excellence, the hardest of all stones, that bears without being crushed by it the weight of the four systems. We were shut up in a prison of granite. It was 8 p.m., and no sign yet of water. My sufferings were terrible. My uncle still pushed forward. He would not stop and kept listening to the murmur of some springs, but there was not a sound. However, I could not hold out for long, for my legs refused to carry me. I struggled against the tortures as long as I could, for I did not want to make him stop. This would be him the death of knell of his hopes, for the day was fast drawing to an end and was his last. At length, my strength completely failed me. I screamed out, "I'm dying! Come to me!" And then I fell flat to the ground. My uncle turned back, folded his arms, and looked at me attentively. Then I heard him mutter in a hollow tone, "This finishes it." A frightful gesture of rage met my glance, and I closed my eye. When I opened them again, I saw my two companions lying motionless, wrapped in their rugs. Were they asleep? For my part, I could not get a moment's sleep. I was too much suffering, aggravated, too, by the thought that there was no remedy for it. My uncle's words echoed in my ears. For such a feeble state, the idea of regaining the surface of the globe was out of the equation. A league and half a terrestrial crust lay above us. The whole weight of it seemed to lie upon my shoulders. I felt crushed and exhausted myself in frantic efforts to turn around on my granite couch. Some hours elapsed. Deep silence resigned, silence of a tomb. Nothing could reach us through these walls, the thinnest of which was 5 miles thick. However, in the midst of my stupor, I thought I heard a noise. It was dark in the tunnel, but looking closely, I fancied I could see the Icelander disappearing, lamp in hand. Why was he going? Was Hans really forsaking us? My uncle was asleep. I tried to call out, but my voice could not make itself heard through the parched lips. The gloom had deepened into the blackness, and the faint echo of the sound had died away. Hans had abandoned us, I cried. Hans! Hans! But these words were spoken within me. They never left my lips. However, after the first moment of fear, I was ashamed of suspecting a man who had given us no ground of suspicion. His departure could not be a flight. Instead of going up the passage, he was going down and farther in it. A bad intentions would have dragged him upward, not downward. This reasoning called me a little, and I came back to another train of ideas. Hans was so tranquil that only some grave motive would have induced him to give up his rest. He had gone on a voyage of discovery. He had heard some distant murmur break on the silent night. Through I had not. Chapter 23. For a whole hour, I was imagining in my delirious brain all the reasons which might have accurated the quiet Icelander. A perfect tangle of absurd ideas got into my head. I thought I was going mad, but at last a noise of footsteps was heard in the depths of the abyss. Hans was coming up again. The faint light began to glimmer on the walls, and then shone fully at the opening of the passage. Hans appeared. I went up to my uncle and put his hand on his shoulder and gently awoke him. My uncle sat up and asked what was the matter. "Vatten," replied the hunter. "Violent pain certainly seems to make one become a polyglot. For though I did not know a single word of Danish, I instinctively understood what the guide meant. 'Water! Water!' I cried, and clapped my hands. And gesticulated as if I were crazy. 'Water!' repeated my uncle. 'Hvar?' he asked, addressing the Icelander. 'Nadat!' replied Hans. 'Where? Down below?' I understood every word. I seized the hunter's hand and grasped them in mine, but he looked at me with a perfect calmness. We were soon ready, and set out along a passage that made a slope of 2 feet of the Phantom. In about an hour we had gone 1,000 fathoms and made a descent of 2,000 feet. At that very moment I heard an unusual sound of something running within the granite wall, a sort of dull roar, like a distant thunder. I had beginning to give way to despair when we had walked half an hour, and still no spring had come in sight. But my uncle apprised that Hans was not mistaken in his announcement, for the noise I heard now was roaring of a torrent. "A torrent?" I exclaimed. "There is no doubt of it. A subterranean river is flowing around us." We hastened our steps, spurred on by hope. The sound of murmuring refreshed me already. It increased sensibly, the torrent of which was running above us at first as now was taking its course along the left wall, roaring and leaping. I passed my hands frequently over the rock, hoping to find some traces of moisture, but in vain. After a half hour passed, another half league. It was evident that the hunter could not have gone farther than this while he was away. Guided by instinct peculiar to mountaineers, he felt this torrent through his neck, but certainly he had not seen the precious liquid at all, nor drank it. Soon it became evident, too, that if we went farther, we shall be going away from the stream, for the rush was growing fainter. We turned back. Hans stopped at the precise spot where the torrent seemed nearest. I sat down beside the wall, the waters dashing within 2 feet of me with extreme violence, but still the granite wall between. Instead of over the likeliest means of getting over this barrier, I yielded once more to despair. Hans looked at me, and I fancied a smile on his lips. He rose and took the lamp. I followed him. We went to the wall, and I saw him lay his ear against the dry stone, slowly moving his place, and always listening intently. He was plainly trying to find out the exact part where the current made the most noise. This point he discovered in the side of wall to the left, about 3 feet from the ground. How excited I felt! I could not venture to guess what he was going to do, but I soon understood and applauded, and moted him with caresses when he lifted the pickaxe to attack the solid rock. "Saved!" I shouted. "Yes!" cried my uncle in rapture. "Hans is right. Ah, the brave fellow! We shall never have hit upon that. I quite believe it. Such an expedient, simple enough as it was, would never have entered our heads. Nothing seemed more dangerous than to give a blow with a pickaxe in this part of the earth's frame. Suppose some dislodgment should occur which would crush us. What if this torrent should burst through the opening and engulf us? There was nothing chimerical in these dangers, but they would not hinder us. Our thirst was so intense that we would have risked being crushed or drowned or dug in the very bed of the ocean to relieve it. Hans did the work, for neither my uncle nor myself could have done it. Our impatient hands would have made the rock fly off fragments under our hasty blows. The guide, on the contrary, was calm and collected, and gradually wore away the rock, but little by little, but continuous strokes, till he had dug an opening about 6 inches wide. I could hear the torrent getting louder. I seemed already to feel the beneficent water touch my lips. Soon the pick had buried itself 2 feet in granite. The operation was already lasted an hour. I waited with impatience, and my uncle wished to employ stronger measures, though I did all I could to dissuade him. We had already seized his pickaxe when suddenly there came a hissing noise, and then a jet of water sprouted out violently and dashed against the opposite wall. Hans, who was almost upset by the force of the shock, gave a cry of pain, the cause of which I soon understood, and cried out in my turn when I found, on plunging my hands into the water, it was boiling. "The water at 200, I exclaimed. "Well, it will cool," replied my uncle. The passage was filled with steam, and a stream formed, which began to run away and lose itself in the subterranean windings. Soon we were able to indulge in our first draught. Oh, how delicious! What a priceless luxury this was! It mattered not what the water was or whence it had come. It was water, and though still warm, it brought back the ebbing life. I drank without sipping, without even tasting. But after my first moment's declaration, I exclaimed, "Why, it is a mineral water! It tastes of iron! Capital for the stomach," said my uncle, "and highly mineralized. This journey is as good as going to the spa or Tolpes. Oh, isn't it good? I should think so. Water obtained 2 leagues below the ground. There is an inky taste about it, but is not disagreeable. No, it really is a famous tonic. Hans has procured us, so I propose this health-giving stream shall receive his name. By all means, and the river is called Hansbach forthwith." Hans was not the least proud of the honor. After he had refreshed himself moderately, he sat down in a corner with his accustomed placidity. "Now," I said, "we must not let this water run away." "Why not?" replied my uncle. "I suspect the spring is unfailing." "Never mind. Let us fill our gourds with the leather and bottle, and try to stop up the hole." My advice was followed. Hans made a bung of granite and tow, and this did his best to drive in it. But it was not so easily done. We scalded our hands over the business, and our efforts were fruitless. After all, the pressure was too great. "It is evident," I said, "that the source of the river is at a great height, to judge by the force of the jet." "There is no doubt about it," replied my uncle. "If this column of water is 32,000 feet high, it has the weight of 1,000 atmospheres. But an idea has just struck me." "What is it?" "Why should we be so bent on bugging up in this hole?" "Why? Because—" Here I stopped, for it was not easy to find a reason. "When our gourds are empty again, how do we know for certain that we shall be able to fill them?" "That's true." "Well, then, let the water run. It will flow down naturally, and be both our guide and refreshment on our route." "That's the capital idea," I exclaimed, "and with this river for our companion, there is no reason why our project should not succeed." "Ah, you are coming to my way of thinking, my boy," said the professor, smiling. "I am doing better than coming. I have come." "Not quite yet. We must have a few hours' rest." I actually forgot it was night, but the chronometer reminded me of the fact, and before long, after we had recruited our strength with food, we lie down, and we were soon all 3 sleeping soundly. Chapter 24. I awoke consequently on Sunday morning without the usual impression on my mind, that I must be up and off immediately, and though we were in the deepest depths, it was not disagreeable. We were quite fit for this existence of troglodytes. I scarcely thought of sun, or stars, or moon, or trees, or houses, or towns, or any of those terrestrial superfluidities which are necessaries to be sublunary to beings. We were fossils now, and I thought such useless marvels absurd. The grotto was an immense hill. The faithful stream ran over the granite floor. At this distance from its source, the water was hardly lukewarm, and could be drank comfortably. Before breakfast, the professor determined to devote an hour or two to the arrangements of this daily notes. First, he said, I'm going to make calculations that I may ascertain our situation exactly. I wish to be able to, on my return, to draw a map of our journey, a sort of vertical selection of the globe, giving a profile of our expedition. That would be a curiosity, Uncle, but would your observations be sufficiently exact? Yes, I have carefully noted the angles and inclines. I am certain there has been no mistake. Let us see first where we are. Take the compass and observe its direction. I looked at the instrument, and after watching it carefully, I replied, southeast by east. Very good, said the professor, marking it down and making some hasty calculations. Well then, my conclusion is that we have made 85 leagues from our starting point. And then we are walking under the Atlantic now. Just so. And perhaps at this moment the tempest is raging above our heads. The ships are being wrecked amid the wild hurricanes. Likely enough. And the whales are lashing the walls of our prison with their tails. Don't be frightened, Axel. They can't shake them. But to return to our calculations, we are in the southeast, 85 leagues from the base of Snaefell. And according to my preceding notes, I reckon we have reached the depth of 16 leagues. 16 leagues, I exclaimed. Undoubtedly. But that is the extreme limit of the Earth's crust, according to science. I don't say it is not. And if there isn't any law of increase in temperature, the heat here ought to be 1,500 degrees. Ought to be, my boy. And all this granite would be in a state of fusion, as it could not possibly remain a solid at that state. You see, however, that is nothing of the sort, and the facts, as usual, give the lie to theories. I am obliged to own it, but still I am very much astonished at it. How does the thermometer stand? 27 6/10. Then philosophers are out in their reckoning by 1,474 4/10. Then the proportional increase of temperature is a mistake, and Humphrey Davy was right, and so I was to listen to him. What do you say to it now? Nothing. I could have found plenty of say if I choose, but I could not admit Humphrey Davy's theory in the least, and I still believed in the central heat, though I did not feel the effect of it. I would really rather have admitted that this chimney of an extinct volcano, being covered in non-conducting lava, did not allow the heat to pass through it. But without stopping to seek for the arguments, I confined myself to the consideration of our actual situation. Uncle, I said, I have no doubt at all your calculations are right, but they bring me to a rigorous conclusion. And what is that, my boy? Speak your mind. At the point we are under the latitude of Iceland. The radius of the earth is scarcely 1,583 leagues. That is 1,583 1/3 leagues. Put down 1,600 leagues in round figures. Out of a journey of 1,600 leagues, we have gone 12. That's just it. And the coast of 85 degrees diagonally. Perfectly so. In about 20 days. Now 16 leagues are 1/100th of the Earth's radius. If we go on at this rate, we should take 2,000 days, or nearly 5.5 years to descend. The professor made no reply. Without reckoning that if a depth 16 leagues is obtained by going 80 horizontally, that would make 8,000 leagues southeast, and it would be a long time before we reach the center if we did not chance first to emerge at some point to the circumference. Hang your calculations, cried my uncle passionately, and hang your hypothesis too. On what ground do they rest? Who told you, pray, that this message did not lead direct to the center? Besides, I have a precedent. What am I doing? Another has already done, and where has he succeeded, I can succeed too. I hope so, but at least may I be allowed to hold your tongue, Axel, if you wish to argue that senseless fashion. I saw plainly that terrible professor was about to leap out of my uncle's skin, and I thought I had better be silent. Now, he said, consult the thermometer. What does it indicate? Considerable pressure? Well, then, you see, we are descending gradually, and we will get accustomed to the density of the atmosphere. We are not least affected by it. Not in the least, except a little pain to the ears. That is nothing. You can get rid of it once by holding your breath very quickly for a minute. Quite so, I said, determined not to contradict him again. There is a positive pleasure even in feeling oneself getting into the denser atmosphere. Have you ever noticed the wonderful clearness of the sound here? Yes, indeed. A deaf man would soon get his hearing again soon, but this density will of course increase. Yes, according to a somewhat indefinite law, it is true that the intensity of the weight will diminish in proportion as we ascend. You know, that is on the surface, that its action is most felt, and the center of the globe objects have no longer any weight. I know, but tell me, in the end, will the air not acquire the density of the water? Undoubtedly, under the pressure of 710 atmospheres, and lower still, of course, the density will increase soon more. How shall we descend, then? Well, we must put stones into our pockets. I declare, uncle, you have an answer for everything. I did not dare go any further into a field of hypothesis, for I should have been sure to have stumbled against some impossibility, in which some would have made the professor start out again. But it was quite evident that the air, under a pressure of possibly 1,000 atmospheres, would pass at last into a solid state. In that case, even supposing that our bodies might have held out, we should be forced to stop in spite of all reasonings in the world. But it was no use in advancing this argument. My uncle would have met with the everlasting secusum, a precedent of not the slightest value, for even quoting the truth of the learned Icelander's narrative, this simple answer might have been made to it. In the 16th century, neither barometers nor anemometers were invented. Consequently, how could Secusum know that he had reached the center of the earth? But I had kept this objection to myself and waited for the course of events. The rest of the day passed on talking and making calculations. I always sided with the Professor Lindenbrock, and advied the perfect indifference of Hans, who blindly wherever the destiny led him, without troubling himself about cause and effect. Chapter 24. Next day, we had already forgotten our past sufferings. I was amazed when I first awoke, not to feel thirsty, and I asked myself what could be the reason. The stream running at my feet gave me a sufficient answer. We breakfasted and drank of its excellent Calabeat water. I felt quite merry and decided to go on. Why should not a man so thoroughly confident as my uncle succeed when he had a zealous guide like Hans, and a determined nephew like me. Such were grand ideas that came to my head. If anyone had proposed my going back to I should have refused indignantly. But unfortunately, we had only to continue our descent. "Come, let us start," I shouted, awakening the old echoes of the globe by my enthusiastic tones. We set out again on Thursday at 8 a.m. The granite passage, with its varied windings and expected bends, seemed almost like a labyrinth's maze. But on the whole, the direction was uniformly southeast. My uncle consulted his compass constantly, and might know exactly how much ground we had gone over. The gallery extended almost horizontally, not sloping more than 2 inches in a flatum at most. The stream ran murmuring softly at our feet. I compared it to some kindly genius who was guiding us underground, and I had caressed with my hand the warm naiad whose songs accompanied our steps. My gay mood all involuntarily took a mythological turn. As for my uncle, he kept fuming up the path for being so horizontal. He loved vertical lines, and put him out of patience to be always going by hypotenuse to the center, instead of sliding along the radius, to use his own expression, but we had no choice. And so long as we were going toward the center, however indirectly, we had no right to complain. Moreover, from time to time, we came to steep slopes. Down the naiad run rushing and roaring, we went with her. On the whole, the day and the next we went over a great distance horizontally, through comparatively little vertically. On Friday, July 10th, we reckoned that there were 30 leagues to the southeast of Reykjavik, and 2.5 leagues deep. We were on front of yawning abyss, and frightful enough it looked. Through my uncle clapped his hands, and he reckoned its depth. "Famous!" he exclaimed. "This will take us a long way, without any trouble, for the protections all the way down make a staircase." The ropes were arranged to avoid any risk of accident, and we commenced the descent. I dare not to call it perilous, for I was already accustomed to that kind of exercise. This abyss was a narrow chasm in the rock, called a fault in the scientific language. It had been evidently caused by the unequal cooling of the earth's surface. If it had never served as a passage for eruptive matter ejected by Snæfell, I could not understand how there was no trace left of it whatever. We were going a sort of spiral staircase, which one might have thought had been constructed by hand of man. We halted every quarter of an hour to take needful rest and stretch our legs. Then we sat down on some projection, with our legs hanging down, eating and talking, or refreshing ourselves with a draught from the stream. The Hansbach, of course, made a cascade down the fault, to the loss of its volume necessarily. But enough remained to quench our thirst, and we knew it must resume its quiet course when it reached a more level ground. In its present foaming, angry state, it made me think of my uncle in some of his passions, while its calm, continuous flow, its hurdo, reminded me of the tranquil Icelander. On the 11th and 12th of July, we were constantly following the windings of the stairs, and had attained a further depth of 2 leagues. We were altogether nearly 5 leagues below the level of the sea. But on the 13th, at noon, the fault, through still going southeast, began to get less vertical, only making the incline 45 degrees. The road now became easier. Through intensely monotonous, it could hardly be otherwise, for there was no scenery to enliven it. On Wednesday, the 15th, there were 7 leagues below the earth, and 50 from Snæfell. Through somewhat fatigued, we were in perfect health, and our medicine chest remained untouched. My uncle noted down every hour the indications of our compass, the chronometer, the manometer, and the thermometer, those which had published in the scientific account of his journey by the 50 leagues horizontally. I could not forbear an exclamation. "What's the matter?" asked my uncle. "Nothing. I was only making a reflection." "What is it, my boy?" "Just this, that if your calculations are correct, we are no longer below Iceland." "Do you think so?" "We can only make sure at once. I took my measurements with the compass on my map, and I found I was quite right. We have passed Cape Portland," I said, "and 50 leagues southeast brings us to open sea." "Below mid-ocean," cried my uncle, rubbing his hands. Then the ocean is really above our heads?" "Of course, Axel. That's not so wonderful. Are there not coal mines at Newcastle extending far along under the sea?" The professor saw nothing extraordinary in the fact, but my mind was quite excited with the idea of walking below the depths of the ocean. And yet, what difference did it make whether the plains and mountains of Iceland were over our heads, or the waves of the Atlantic? It was all one, since the solid granite overarched us. Soon I got used to the thought, for the passage, whether straight or winding, fantastic alike in its slopes and its turns, but always running southeast, was rapidly leading us toward the heart of the globe. 3 days later, on Saturday, July 18th, in the evening, we reached a sort of grotto, of considerable size. Here my uncle came to a halt and paid Hans his weekly wage, and it was agreed that the tomorrow should be a day of rest.